The screech of tires tearing across asphalt was the last thing Jiang Xingxing remembered clearly. A blinding flash of headlights, a sickening lurch, and then the world tilted on its axis. The airbag exploded against her, a harsh, burning embrace. Disoriented, she blinked against the stinging smoke, the smell of burnt rubber thick in the air. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine, the world a distorted blur of shattered glass and crumpled metal. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. Not like this, she thought, a desperate plea echoing in the hollow of her being. Not after everything. Her hand, trembling uncontrollably, fumbled for her phone, its smooth surface strangely comforting against her clammy palm. The screen cracked, spiderwebbed fractures obscuring the display, but it still functioned. With numb fingers, she dialed the only number that offered a flicker of hope, a lifeline in the encroaching darkness. "Help," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy, barely audible above the ringing in her ears. "Uncle," the word caught in her throat, a mixture of shame and desperation. He was the last person she wanted to burden, but the only one she could turn to. The world spun, nausea rising in her throat. The pain, dull and throbbing at first, began to sharpen, radiating from her abdomen. A new wave of fear washed over her, stronger than the fear of the crash itself. The twins. She clutched her stomach protectively, a primal instinct overriding the throbbing pain. My babies, she hadn't wanted them, had planned, but now, the thought of losing them sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. "Help me," she cried, her voice louder now, laced with panic. The ringing stopped. A deep, familiar voice answered, sharp and alert, cutting through the chaos. "Xingxing. What's wrong?" Relief flooded through her, weak and shaky, but potent nonetheless. Like a drowning person grasping a rope. "Uncle," she sobbed, the word a choked gasp. "There are bad guys," the lie tumbled out, a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. To justify her call. To hide the truth that she was alone, terrified, and pregnant with his children. She wasn't sure what she meant by bad guys. Perhaps they were the shadows that danced at the periphery of her vision, the whispers of her past that never truly faded. Or perhaps they were the demons of her own making, the regrets and fears that clawed at her conscience. "Where are you?" His voice was tight, controlled. She could hear the underlying tension, the barely suppressed urgency. She struggled to give him her location, the words slurred and disjointed. The world began to fade in and out, the darkness at the edges creeping closer. She clung to the sound of his voice, the only anchor in the swirling vortex of pain and fear. "Stay with me, Xingxing," he commanded, his voice cutting through the fog in her mind. "I'm on my way." The words were a promise, a lifeline. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness, trusting, for the first time in a long time, that someone would be there to catch her. Fu Jingqi's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the leather creaking under the pressure. He pushed the car to its limits, weaving through the late-night traffic, his mind a maelstrom of anxiety. Xingxing's panicked voice echoed in his ears, fueling his frantic drive. Bad guys? The thought gnawed at him. He knew her past, the shadows that haunted her. The fear in her voice was real, raw, and it chilled him to the bone. He reached the crash site, a chaotic scene of flashing lights and emergency personnel. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the wreckage, his eyes searching for her. He spotted her slumped in the back of an ambulance, a paramedic attending to her. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He strode towards her, his long legs eating up the distance, his face a mask of controlled concern. He reached her side, his eyes searching hers. She was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused, but she was alive. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, hesitant. He wasn't sure how she would react. He had always maintained a careful distance, respecting her vulnerability, never wanting to overstep. But now, seeing her so fragile, so broken, all his carefully constructed walls crumbled. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Her skin was cold, clammy. He felt a faint tremor run through her body as his touch registered. He squeezed gently, offering silent reassurance. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "Uncle," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and something else, fear. Shame. He couldn't decipher it. He didn't press her. He simply held her hand, his presence a silent promise of protection. Later, at the hospital, after the doctors had confirmed that both she and the babies were stable, he sat by her bedside, watching her sleep. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. He studied her, his gaze lingering on the delicate curve of her cheek, the faint flutter of her eyelashes. He had never allowed himself to truly see her, to acknowledge the fragile beauty that lay beneath her guarded exterior. But now, stripped bare of her defenses, she was breathtaking. He thought of the twins, the life growing inside her. His children. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had always lived a life of careful control, of calculated detachment. He had never wanted children, had actively avoided the entanglement of family. And yet, here he was, on the precipice of fatherhood, his life irrevocably intertwined with this young woman, this fragile creature who had stumbled into his life and turned it upside down. The rising sun painted the hospital room in hues of pale gold, chasing away the shadows. Xingxing stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her dazed eyes. "Uncle," she murmured, her voice still weak. He reached out, his hand gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let her face it alone. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, sharp and unwelcome. Xingxing's eyelids fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room momentarily blinding. A dull ache pulsed at the back of her skull, a nagging reminder of the screech of tires, the jarring impact. She swallowed, her throat dry and scratchy, the metallic tang of blood faint but present. The events of the accident swam back in disjointed flashes, a red blur, the horn's desperate blare, then nothingness. Where was she? What had happened? A wave of nausea washed over her, and she instinctively curled inwards, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. A strange flutter of fear, unfamiliar and sharp, pricked at her. A blurry figure in white approached. "You're awake," a gentle voice said, and the face of a young doctor came into focus. "How are you feeling?" Xingxing's voice was a croak. "My head hurts." Her mind raced, replaying the accident. Had she hurt anyone? Was she seriously injured? The fear intensified, constricting her chest. The doctor smiled reassuringly. "That's normal. You've been through quite an ordeal. You have a mild concussion, but thankfully, no major injuries." She paused, her smile widening. "We also have some good news." Xingxing's brow furrowed. Good news? In this fog of pain and confusion, the concept felt alien. "Congratulations," the doctor beamed, adjusting the stethoscope around her neck. "You are pregnant." Pregnant? The word struck Xingxing like a physical blow. She stared blankly at the doctor, the implications of that single word reverberating through her. Pregnant. A child. Responsibility. Fear, raw and visceral, choked her. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything. The doctor, oblivious to the turmoil raging within her, continued, her voice laced with a cheerful professionalism that grated on Xingxing's raw nerves. Or should I say, twins? Twins. 2 lives. 2 tiny, helpless beings depending on her. Xingxing felt a cold dread creeping through her veins. She closed her eyes, willing this to be a nightmare, a cruel hallucination brought on by the concussion. But the doctor's words echoed in her ears, each syllable a heavy weight dragging her further into despair. "Doctor," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to have an abortion." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. It was the only way. She couldn't possibly. The doctor's cheerful demeanor faltered, replaced by a professional concern. "I understand this might be overwhelming. But you are in early stages. You have time to consider your options. We can discuss this further later." Xingxing merely nodded, a hollow ache settling in her chest. Time to consider. But what was there to consider? Her life was already a tangled mess of broken promises and dashed hopes. A child, let alone 2, would only complicate things further. She thought of her adoptive parents, their cold indifference, their constant demands. How could she bring a child into that environment? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Later that night, the throbbing in her head subsided, but the emotional turmoil continued to rage. She lay in the sterile hospital bed, the rhythmic beeping of the machines a relentless soundtrack to her despair. The news of the twins had set off a chain reaction within her, dredging up buried memories, old wounds. Her fingers unconsciously traced the faint scars on her wrist, a grim testament to a past she desperately tried to forget. She had always longed for a different life, a life free from the suffocating grip of her adoptive family, a life where she could breathe. But this felt like a life sentence. A soft knock on the door startled her. A nurse entered, followed by a tall, imposing figure. Xingxing's breath hitched. It was him. Fu Jingqi, the man she had met only briefly, the man who the memories of that night were hazy, fragmented, but the shame and regret remained. "Mr. Fu," she murmured, her voice barely audible. He approached her bedside, his expression unreadable. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his presence radiating an aura of power and control. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Better," she lied, avoiding his eyes. She couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't bear the weight of his presence. He was a reminder of her vulnerability, her desperation. He pulled up a chair, the movement smooth and deliberate. "The doctor informed me about the situation." Xingxing's heart pounded in her chest. She braced herself for his judgment, his condemnation. But it never came. Instead, he said, "I will take responsibility." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Responsibility. What did that even mean? He was a powerful man, used to getting his way. What kind of responsibility did he envision? Financial support? A fleeting visit? The uncertainty gnawed at her. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I mean I will ensure that you and the children are taken care of. You won't have to worry about anything." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that surprised her. There was no accusation in his tone, no hint of blame. Only a quiet resolve, a sense of acceptance. Xingxing's mind raced. She had expected anger, disgust, perhaps even indifference. But this was unexpected. A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, began to bloom within her. Perhaps this wasn't the end of the world after all. Perhaps this was a new beginning. A chance to build a different life, a better life, for herself and her children. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it was now mingled with a cautious optimism, a sense of possibility that she hadn't dared to imagine before. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clung to Xingxing like a second skin. It had been days since the accident, days spent in the sterile white room, the rhythmic beeping of machines a constant reminder of the life growing inside her. 2 lives. Twins. The word echoed in the hollow spaces of her heart, a strange mix of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Resentment, perhaps. Or was it a flicker of something akin to wonder? She pushed the thought away, focusing on the dull ache in her abdomen. A loud, brash voice shattered the quiet. Xingxing. It was Jiang Yaozu, her brother, his face flushed, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. I heard about the accident. Are you all right? He rushed to her bedside, his concern theatrical, too loud, too much. Xingxing recoiled slightly. He doesn't care, she thought, her stomach clenching. He's here for something. His sudden appearance after years of near silence could only mean one thing, trouble. I'm fine, she mumbled, pulling the thin hospital blanket higher. Good, good, he said, his voice laced with false cheer. He lowered his voice, leaning closer. Listen, Xingxing, things are a bit tight right now. I was wondering, could you lend me some money? The question hung in the air, thick with the unspoken history between them. Years of his gambling debts, his reckless spending, her reluctant handouts. A wave of nausea washed over her, stronger than the morning sickness. I'm in the hospital, Yaozu. I don't have any money. He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Come on, Xingxing. Don't play coy. I heard about the guy, the rich one. The one who caused the accident. His eyes gleamed with avarice. He'll take care of you, won't he? Before Xingxing could respond, the doctor entered, his presence a welcome interruption. He held a folder, his expression grave. Miss Jiang, I have the results of the amniocentesis. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. The twins you are carrying are unique. Their genetic makeup is remarkable. It is possible, highly probable in fact, that this is the only time you will be able to conceive. The word struck Xingxing like a physical blow. Only once. These 2 tiny lives, conceived under such chaotic circumstances, were her only chance. The thought of abortion, which had been a constant, nagging presence in her mind, suddenly felt wrong. A profound shift occurred within her, a subtle realignment of her priorities. The fear remained, but now it was intertwined with a fierce, protective instinct. Jiang Yaozu, oblivious to the weight of the doctor's words, continued his wheedling. So, about that money, Xingxing, the doctor, his patience wearing thin, cleared his throat. Mr. Jiang, if you'll excuse us, I need to discuss some private matters with my patient. Yaozu, reluctantly, backed away, muttering under his breath. Later that afternoon, a hush fell over the hospital room as Fu Jingqi entered. He moved with an aura of quiet power, his presence filling the space. He was dressed impeccably, his suit a dark contrast to the sterile white of the room. Xingxing's heart pounded against her ribs, a strange mixture of apprehension and relief. He approached her bedside, his gaze searching hers. How are you feeling? His voice was low, gentle, a stark contrast to his formidable reputation. Better, she whispered, her throat suddenly dry. She found herself unable to look away from his eyes, a depth in them she hadn't noticed before. He sat down beside her, his hand hovering over hers for a moment before resting lightly on top. The warmth of his touch sent a surprising jolt through her. He spoke to the doctor, asking detailed questions about her health, about the babies. He listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Xingxing watched him, her mind racing. This man, this powerful, enigmatic man, was the father of her children. And he was here, taking responsibility, caring. It was a stark contrast to the men she had known, to her adoptive father's indifference, to Yaozu's selfish demands. A sudden commotion erupted outside the room. Jiang Yaozu's voice, raised in anger, cut through the quiet. "I need to see my sister. It's important." Fu Jingqi's expression hardened. He rose to his feet, his movements swift and decisive. He stepped out into the corridor, his voice low and menacing. Xingxing couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone was enough. It was the tone of a man used to command, a man not to be trifled with. A few minutes later, Fu Jingqi returned, his face impassive. He sat back down beside Xingxing, his hand finding hers again. "It's taken care of," he said simply. Later, Xingxing overheard a hushed conversation between two nurses. "Did you see Mr. Fu just fire that man?" one whispered. "Apparently, he was harassing Miss Jiang, demanding money. And Mr. Fu just fired him. Just like that?" "Yes. Apparently the man worked for one of Fu Jingqi's subsidiaries. He asked, 'Boss, can I get an advance on next month's salary?' and Mr. Fu simply replied, 'You were fired.'" The nurse's voice was filled with awe. "That's power for you." Xingxing closed her eyes, a slow smile spreading across her face. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected turn of events was not a tragedy, but a chance. A chance for a new beginning, a chance for a life she had never dared to dream of. A life with her children, protected by the enigmatic, powerful man who, against all odds, had entered her life and changed it forever. The antiseptic smell of the hospital still lingered, but now, beneath it, she could detect the faintest hint of something else. Something sweet, something hopeful. The scent of new beginnings. The stale cigarette smoke clung to the air, a greasy film coating the back of Xingxing's throat. Her brother, Yaozu, paced like a caged animal, his phone clutched in a sweaty hand. The room, barely larger than a closet, pulsed with a nervous energy that mirrored the frantic thumping in Xingxing's chest. She hugged herself, the thin fabric of her dress offering little comfort against the chill that seemed to emanate from the cracked concrete walls. He said it would be quick, she thought, her stomach twisting with a nauseous blend of fear and the persistent morning sickness that had become her constant companion. He said it was just a meeting. But the three men lounging on the stained sofa, their eyes heavy with a predatory gleam, told a different story. Yaozu slammed his phone onto a rickety table, the sound echoing sharply in the confined space. "They're here," he muttered, his voice tight with a desperation Xingxing knew all too well. It was the same desperation that had driven him to gamble away their parents' meager savings, the same desperation that now painted him as a cornered rat. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. This was her life, a relentless cycle of his mistakes and her forced complicity. She closed her eyes briefly, picturing the two tiny lives nestled within her, a fragile promise of a future she wasn't sure she could secure. A heavy knock rattled the door, and Yaozu's hand twitched towards his pocket before he thought better of it. He plastered a strained smile on his face, a grotesque imitation of ease, and swung the door open. Two men, bulky and imposing, filled the doorway, their shadows stretching across the room like a shroud. A third man, slighter but with an unsettlingly sharp gaze, followed close behind. Xingxing's breath hitched in her throat. These weren't businessmen. Their expensive suits couldn't disguise the air of menace that clung to them like the cigarette smoke. "Sister," Yaozu said, his voice unnaturally high-pitched, "these gentlemen are interested in helping us." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Xingxing's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Helping us? Helping him. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever help they offered would come at a steep price, a price she would be forced to pay. The slighter man, who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward, his eyes raking over Xingxing with a calculating gaze that made her skin crawl. "We've heard interesting things," he said, his voice smooth and laced with a false cordiality that made her stomach churn. "Your brother tells us you're in a delicate situation." He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. "A situation that could be advantageous." Xingxing recoiled, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. The unborn children, her secret burden and fragile hope, suddenly felt like a target painted on her back. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Sister, you have to save me," Yaozu pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperation that bordered on hysteria. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. Just talk to them." His eyes, bloodshot and pleading, met hers. "He doesn't even see me," she thought, a wave of despair washing over her. "He only sees a way out." The leader chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Xingxing's spine. "Your brother has certain debts," he explained, his tone laced with a chilling amusement. "Debts that need to be repaid." He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on her stomach. "And we're willing to be flexible in how he settles his accounts." Xingxing's mind raced, frantically searching for an escape, a way out of this nightmare. But the room felt smaller, the air thicker, the men closing in on her like predators circling their prey. "Two don't have any money," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not interested in money, dear girl," the leader purred, his voice dripping with a sickening sweetness. "We're interested in other assets." He gestured towards her with a flick of his wrist. "As long as you serve the three of us well, we can give him some time." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. Xingxing's blood ran cold. The room spun, the faces of the men blurring into a grotesque mask of greed and lust. The stale air choked her, the smell of cigarettes mingling with the stench of fear. She stumbled back, her hand clutching her stomach protectively. "No," she thought, her mind screaming in silent protest. "This can't be happening." But the predatory gleam in their eyes, the cruel twist of their lips, told her that this was her reality, a reality she couldn't escape. The image of Fu Jingqi's face flashed through her mind, a fleeting memory of strength and security. A sob caught in her throat. "Where are you?" she thought, her heart aching with a desperate longing for a rescue she knew wouldn't come. She was trapped, alone, with the weight of her brother's mistakes and the terrifying knowledge that the price of his freedom would be her own. The biting wind whipped at Xingxing's already frayed nerves. The streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows that danced with the dust devils swirling around her ankles. Escape had been her only thought, a frantic scramble away from her brother's enraged creditors. Yaozu. That name, once a symbol of familial comfort, now tasted like ash in her mouth. How easily he'd gambled her life away, a mere pawn in his desperate games. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a protective gesture that was both new and fiercely instinctive. 2 lives. 2 tiny, vulnerable lives depended on her. She had to be strong. Stronger than the fear gnawing at her insides, stronger than the gnawing despair that whispered of her worthlessness. The shouts of the men pursuing her echoed off the grimy walls of the buildings, closing in. Her breath hitched, a choked sob threatening to erupt. Each pounding footstep behind her was a hammer blow against her fragile hope. Why? Why did life insist on testing her, pushing her to the very edge of the precipice? She had envisioned a different future, one where she controlled her destiny, where the choices were hers. But the reality was a suffocating cage, its bars forged from the mistakes of others and her own past. Stop. You think you can run from us? The gruff voice grated on her ears, a physical manifestation of her terror. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she dared not stop. The alleyway ahead offered a sliver of hope, a dark labyrinth where she might lose them. But as she stumbled into its shadows, a strong hand clamped down on her shoulder. Panic surged, momentarily blinding her to everything but the primal instinct to fight. She thrashed, a trapped animal desperate for freedom. "Dare to run," a low, calm voice cut through the chaos. The words, though edged with steel, held a strange reassurance. It wasn't the voice of her pursuers. She looked up, her vision blurring with tears, and saw him. Fu Jingqi. He stood there, an imposing figure against the backdrop of the alley's gloom. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cool detachment, but the tension in his jaw, the subtle clench of his fist betrayed something deeper. He was angry. Not at her, she realized with a flicker of surprise, but at the men who dared to touch her. The creditors, emboldened by their numbers, initially sneered at his intervention. They muttered amongst themselves, words like interference and rich boy reaching her ears. But as Fu Jingqi's gaze swept over them, cold and calculating, their bravado began to crumble. She had seen that look before, that quiet menace that radiated from him, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that these men were about to learn a very hard lesson. "Let me clean up this person," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet each word resonated with an undeniable authority. He didn't wait for their response. He moved with a swiftness that belied his size, his actions precise and brutal. Xingxing watched, numb with shock, as he systematically dismantled their aggression, his movements economical and devastatingly effective. There was no grandstanding, no theatrical display of power. Just cold, calculated efficiency. Within minutes, the men were scattered, whimpering and clutching at their injuries. The sudden silence that descended was almost deafening. Xingxing stood there, trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was slowly giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. She felt a hand on her arm, a gentle touch that startled her. It was Fu Jingqi. His eyes, no longer the icy pools of a moment ago, held a flicker of concern. He didn't speak, merely guided her away from the alley, his presence a silent bulwark against the lingering fear that clung to her like a shroud. He led her to his car, the sleek black vehicle a stark contrast to the grimy alleyway. He opened the door for her, a gesture that seemed both formal and strangely intimate in the aftermath of the violence. As she sank into the plush leather seat, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. She closed her eyes, the image of Fu Jingqi's unflinching defense playing on repeat behind her eyelids. He had saved her. Not just from her brother's creditors, but from the despair that threatened to engulf her. His actions spoke volumes, echoing louder than any words of comfort could have. He was a man of few words, she knew, but his actions resonated with a depth that transcended language. He started the car, the engine purring to life, a soothing counterpoint to the chaotic symphony of her thoughts. Where were they going? What would happen next? The questions swirled in her mind, but for the first time in a long time, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl within her. He was there. He would protect her. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was all she needed to face the uncertain future. The rhythmic hum of the engine, the warmth of the car's interior, the silent presence of the man beside her, these small comforts became anchors in the storm, grounding her in the present, reminding her that she was not alone. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of colors against the darkening sky. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew, with a growing certainty, that wherever it was, she wouldn't have to face it alone. He was there, a silent guardian, a protector in the shadows. And in that realization, a strange sense of peace began to settle over her, a fragile tranquility she hadn't felt in years. The scent of lilies, faint yet persistent, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell that clung to Xingxing's memory. The plush sofa beneath her felt alien, too soft, too yielding. She traced the intricate floral patterns on the silk cushions, a nervous habit she couldn't seem to break. Just hours ago, she was in a sterile hospital room, the cold dread of an impending abortion clinging to her like a shroud. Now, she was here, in a stranger's opulent home, the man she knew only as uncle, hovering nearby. He moved with a quiet grace that belied a hidden strength, a power she couldn't quite define. "Are you comfortable?" His voice, low and resonant, broke through her thoughts. He held a steaming mug towards her, the aroma of ginger and honey swirling in the air. Xingxing nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Comfortable? How could she be comfortable? Her life, once a predictable path of quiet desperation, had veered sharply into the unknown. She accepted the mug, her fingers brushing against his. His touch sent a strange jolt through her, a warmth that spread from her fingertips to her core. "Drink this. It will help with the nausea." She sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. Nausea. Morning sickness. The reality of her situation hit her with renewed force. Twins. Two lives growing inside her, a future she hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted. Over the next few days, the initial disorientation began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The man she called uncle cared for her with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. He arranged for doctors, ensured she ate nutritious meals, and filled the apartment with soft music and the fragrant scent of lilies. He never pressed her, never questioned her decisions, yet his presence was a constant, reassuring anchor in the storm that raged within her. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside the panoramic windows, he sat across from her, a serious expression etched on his face. "Xingxing," he began, his voice unusually grave, "there are some things I need to tell you." Her heart pounded against her ribs. What could it be? Was he going to ask her to leave? To give up the babies? He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "You called me uncle. But that's not entirely accurate." His gaze held hers, a strange intensity in his dark eyes. "I am Fu Jingqi." The name echoed in her mind, a name she'd heard whispered in hushed tones, a name synonymous with power and wealth. Fu Jingqi. The reclusive business magnate. But how? Her mind reeled. The expensive car, the opulent apartment, the quiet authority, it all clicked into place. You're him," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes." He hesitated, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "And the children, they are mine." Xingxing's breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and confusing, suddenly formed a coherent picture. The night of the accident, the fleeting encounter, it all came rushing back. "Two don't know what to say," she whispered, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. "Say nothing," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "But I will be responsible for you. For the children." The next few days passed in a blur. The news of her connection to Fu Jingqi reached her adoptive parents, and they descended upon the apartment like vultures, their eyes gleaming with avarice. Their demands for money, their thinly veiled threats, brought back the familiar ache of her childhood, the constant feeling of being unwanted, a burden. Fu Jingqi, however, remained a steadfast shield, deflecting their greed with an icy calm that sent shivers down Xingxing's spine. He dealt with them swiftly and decisively, his actions speaking louder than any words. Seeing him defend her, protect her, ignited a flicker of hope within her, a hope she thought long extinguished. She watched him one afternoon, his back to her as he spoke to Lin Chengyuan, his associate, his voice low and firm. He meant it, she realized, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. He truly intended to take responsibility. Not just for the children, but for her as well. The thought of abortion, once a desperate necessity, now felt like a betrayal. These tiny lives growing inside her, they were a part of him, a part of her. And for the first time, she felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield them from the world, from the pain she had known. "I'm keeping them," she announced one evening, her voice surprisingly firm. Fu Jingqi turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Yes," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I mean, the kids are mine. Then I will be responsible for them." He simply nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of relief, of shared understanding. In that moment, Xingxing felt a shift within her, a quiet acceptance of her fate, of the unexpected path her life had taken. The fear hadn't completely vanished, but it was overshadowed by a nascent hope, a fragile sense of possibility. The lilies in the vase, their fragrance filling the room, seemed to symbolize a new beginning, a promise of a life she never dared to imagine. The presence of Fu Jingqi, once a source of bewilderment, now felt like a sanctuary, a safe haven in the turbulent sea of her life. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The plush carpet beneath her feet felt alien, a stark contrast to the worn linoleum she was accustomed to. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet in the vastness of Fu Jingqi's living room. Xingxing traced the outline of a delicate porcelain vase with her gaze, her mind a whirlwind of confused emotions. Just days ago, her life had been a precarious tightrope walk. Now, she found herself enveloped in a world of quiet luxury, the scent of lilies mingling with the subtle aroma of polished wood. "Is this real?" she wondered, her hand instinctively going to her still flat stomach. The twins, a constant source of anxiety, now felt like a fragile bridge to this unexpected stability. Fu Jingqi, or uncle as she still hesitantly called him, sat opposite her, his presence a comforting weight in the spacious room. He spoke softly, his voice a low rumble that resonated through her, outlining the details of the arrangements he had made. Doctors, specialists, nutritionists all at her disposal. He'd even brought in a renowned chef to cater to her dietary needs. "Treat him like you treat me. Do not neglect," he instructed the household staff, his gaze unwavering as it met Xingxing's. A flicker of something akin to warmth crossed his austere features, a subtle shift that didn't go unnoticed by Xingxing. He cares, she realized, a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief welling within her. He actually cares. It wasn't just about the babies, it was about her. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of appointments and consultations. The fear that had gnawed at her began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of security. The hushed elegance of Fu Jingqi's home became her sanctuary, a world away from the cramped, suffocating apartment she shared with her adoptive parents. She still woke up some nights, heart pounding, expecting to hear their harsh voices, their constant criticisms echoing in her ears. But then, the soft glow of the bedside lamp would reassure her, the quiet hum of the air conditioning a constant reminder of her new reality. One afternoon, while browsing through a selection of maternity clothes provided by Fu Jingqi's meticulously efficient staff, Xingxing received a call. It was Jiang Yaozu, her adoptive brother, his voice slick with feigned concern. He'd heard about her good fortune and wanted to celebrate. Xingxing's stomach clenched. She knew what he wanted. Money. He'd always been quick to exploit her vulnerabilities. She met him at a quiet cafe, her heart heavy with apprehension. He was all smiles and false camaraderie, but his eyes, she noticed, held a calculating glint. He spoke vaguely of needing funds for a business opportunity, his words dripping with insincerity. Xingxing, emboldened by her newfound security, refused. "This is for my children," she stated firmly, her voice surprising even herself with its strength. Yaozu's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of resentment. He muttered something about ingratitude before storming off. Xingxing watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over her. This is the last time, she vowed silently. I won't let him use me again. Returning to Fu Jingqi's home felt like stepping back into a haven. She found him in his study, surrounded by stacks of documents. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. Everything all right? He asked, his voice laced with concern. Xingxing hesitated, then recounted her encounter with Yaozu. I will investigate this matter for you, Fu Jingqi said, his tone calm but laced with steel. Xingxing felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew he would handle it, efficiently and discreetly. The confrontation with her adoptive parents was inevitable. They arrived at Fu Jingqi's home uninvited, their faces etched with a mixture of greed and indignation. They demanded money, their voices rising in pitch as they accused Xingxing of abandoning them. Xingxing stood her ground, her voice trembling but resolute. They are my parents after all, she told Fu Jingqi, her eyes pleading with him to understand her dilemma. But even as she spoke, a part of her knew that this charade had to end. Fu Jingqi, with a quiet authority that commanded respect, offered them a sum of money, a final severance. They accepted, their faces revealing their mercenary nature. As they left, Xingxing felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was over. Days later, Lin Chengyuan, Fu Jingqi's trusted associate, approached Xingxing with a photograph. It was a faded image of a young couple, their faces etched with worry. These are your biological parents, Lin Chengyuan explained, his voice gentle. They've been searching for you for years. Xingxing stared at the photograph, her heart pounding in her chest. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile stared back at her. It was An Chuang, the woman from the noodle shop, the one who had shown her unexpected kindness. Tears welled in Xingxing's eyes. She had spent her life feeling rootless, unwanted. Now, a sliver of hope, a fragile tendril of belonging, began to unfurl within her. The future, once a bleak and uncertain landscape, suddenly shimmered with the promise of love and family. The twins, once a symbol of her misfortune, now felt like a precious gift, a link to a past she was finally ready to embrace and a future she could finally dare to dream of. The harsh glare of the stage lights felt intrusive, a stark contrast to the icy knot twisting in Xingxing's stomach. Her fingers, slick with a nervous sweat, tightened around the buzzer. Around her, the whispers of the audience were a dull roar, a wave threatening to pull her under. The brain. Such a pretentious title for a game show, yet here she was, her future, her children's future, resting on the speed of her synapse firing. Money. She needed money. Not for frivolous desires, not for pretty dresses or fancy dinners. For survival. For the two lives blossoming within her. She closed her eyes, briefly, picturing their tiny forms, a fierce protectiveness rising within her, pushing back the fear. Final question, the host's voice boomed, amplified by the stadium speakers. Xingxing opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the screen as the complex equation materialized. Her mind, a whirlwind of numbers and symbols, began its rapid calculations. The other contestants, their faces etched with concentration, were mere blurs in her periphery. This wasn't just a game. It was a lifeline. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight, yet beneath it, a strange sense of calm settled within her. Almost a detachment. As if some other part of her, some deeper, more primal instinct, had taken control. Time seemed to slow, to stretch, each second an eternity. The buzzer in her hand vibrated with anticipation, a physical manifestation of her racing thoughts. Suddenly, the solution crystallized in her mind, a clear and undeniable answer. Her fingers moved, almost without conscious thought, slamming the buzzer. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the tense silence. The spotlight focused solely on her. The world held its breath. Jiang Xingxing, the host declared, his voice laced with excitement. Is your answer? Xingxing took a deep breath, the icy knot in her stomach beginning to thaw. 147, she stated, her voice steady and clear, surprising even herself. A beat of silence. Then, the stadium erupted. Confetti rained down, the lights flashed, and the host's voice, now a distant echo, announced her victory. We have a winner. The noise, the lights, the sudden rush of congratulations, it was overwhelming. Yet, through it all, one thought pierced the chaos: I won. I did it. She had secured their future. A faint smile touched her lips. Later, away from the blinding lights and the cacophony of the crowd, the reality of her victory settled in. The check in her hands felt heavy, tangible proof of her hard work, her intelligence. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, a deep, bone-weary tiredness. But it was a good tiredness, a satisfied tiredness. A familiar car pulled up beside her. Lin Chengyuan, uncle's ever-present associate, stepped out, his face a mixture of respect and something akin to awe. Congratulations, Miss Jiang, he said, his voice hushed, as if still in disbelief. Archie is waiting for you. Xingxing nodded, her mind already racing ahead, planning, calculating. The hospital bills, the prenatal vitamins, a safe and secure place to live, the pieces of her future were slowly falling into place. The car ride was a blur. Xingxing barely registered the passing scenery, lost in her own thoughts. She hadn't seen uncle since the hospital, a deliberate distance she had maintained. Seeing him now, in the quiet elegance of his study, brought a rush of complex emotions. Gratitude, fear, a strange, unsettling flutter that she couldn't quite name. He stood by the window, his back to her, his silhouette stark against the city lights. He turned as she entered, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, usually guarded, held a warmth she hadn't seen before. I won the championship, she announced, a small, hesitant smile gracing her lips. The words felt inadequate, a pale reflection of the tumultuous emotions swirling within her. He crossed the room, his steps measured, his presence filling the space. He stopped before her, his gaze searching her face. I know, he said, his voice low and deep. I watched. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Xingxing lowered her gaze, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. She had rehearsed this conversation countless times in her head, planning what to say, how to express her gratitude, her everything. But now, facing him, the words seemed to evaporate. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, an unexpected jolt of electricity. I want to study medicine, she blurted out, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was a dream she had long buried, a flicker of hope she had dared not acknowledge. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face. Then you will, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. I'll make sure of it. Later, as they sat together, the silence between them no longer heavy, but comfortable, filled with a shared understanding, Aunt Chuang arrived. Her face, etched with years of regret, softened as she looked at Xingxing. The unspoken words hung in the air, thick with emotion. Finally, Aunt Chuang reached out, her hand trembling, and took Xingxing's. Tears welled up in her eyes. My girl, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Xingxing stared at her, her own heart aching with a mix of pain and a longing she hadn't realized she'd carried for so long. She leaned into the touch, a silent acceptance, a quiet forgiveness. The years of separation, the pain, the resentment, it all began to melt away, replaced by a fragile, nascent hope. That night, as Xingxing lay in bed, the events of the day replaying in her mind, Uncle's words echoed in her ears. Girl, he had said, his voice husky, his gaze intense, I like you, don't you? I love you. We'll get the certificate after you recover." The words, so unexpected, so real, sent a wave of warmth through her. She closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. The future, once a bleak and uncertain landscape, now held a promise of happiness, of love, of family. A future she had never dared to dream of, but one she now embraced with open arms.